Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today from Curiosity to Clarity, Framing Research Questions and Finding the Right Data. I'm Ken Matos. I'm your host from HiBob today, and I'm very happy to be joined by my good friend and colleague, Ben Eubanks.
All right. Hey, everybody, glad to be here. Looking forward to, I think it's fair to say, Ken, nerding out with everybody a little bit today on research questions and getting into the data, really figuring out how we can do this in a way that allows us to have the impact we want to have. That's ultimately what this is all about. So we're excited to be here with you. I'm the Chief Research Officer for Lighthouse Research and Advisory, author, speaker, and my background as an HR practitioner, a professional. It gives me some good practical lenses on some of the things, and the data that I get to collect helps me to speak to these things and sound almost as smart as Dr. Ken here. So glad to be here with you and looking forward to some fun.
Absolutely. So before we get started, I would love to ask my colleague to post a poll that we do at the beginning of every one of our webinars. So you should be seeing that pop up any moment now. And now that that's up, we will keep going. So the idea for today's conversation really focuses on the question of how do you ask the right questions? Very often, you, as an analyst, are working on a project, trying to help somebody discover something that's going to help them drive their business forward. And somehow it doesn't, it's not working, it gets messy. And when you trace it back, a lot of times I find it's a question of like, what were we even trying to solve for in the first place? And so, Ben, I'd love to ask you the question of what's one workplace question that you've asked that turned out to be too vague or too broad? Uh, I'd also love to pitch this to our audience to think about what's a question that hasn't quite worked out for you. And if you could post that in our chat, we may get around to dissecting one of those questions and helping you out solve your problem.
That may be my most favorite part of this conversation today. So make sure y'all drop that in there. Drop your own question in you're trying to answer overall. So for me, Ken, one of the ones that I tried to answer that, again, I tell the story all the time, I feel like, but I tried to answer the problem of how could we address turnover? And I didn't look at all the underlying things, all the scenarios leading up to it. I didn't think about how I communicated it. I just went and looked at a bunch of data and just plopped that on someone's desk and thought they were going to embrace it and celebrate it. And it didn't turn out that way. In the end, it was actually a pretty soul-crushing experience. Looking back now, I understand why I made mistakes in that. But at the moment, I was like, everybody's going to want to see this. They're going to want to be as excited as I am. And I just jumped right to it versus really thinking broadly and carefully about what sort of things I wanted to get to in that. So if I could wave my magic wand, go back, I would have done a little more prep work on the audience I was speaking to, the data I was gathering, really helped understand how that came to be. Because at the time we had never really done that analysis before. So it was like I was almost speaking a foreign language to our team.
Mm.
And I didn't show up speaking in a way that really connected and communicated that to them. And again, we'll talk about that today probably. It's not just what you share, but how you share it that's going to get the point across.
Absolutely. And I remember working earlier in my career and getting asked the question, are our employees engaged? I was like, yes, not much you can do with that. Like,
Yes.
yes, no questions. Like one of the big things that I always hate is like a yes, no question. Because very often there's a follow-up question. You're like, oh, well, I didn't prepare for that. So it's like, are our employees engaged? Engaged with what? With their work, with their rewards, with the mission that we're putting forward. There's a lot of different things that employees can be engaged with, and being able to present a more coherent, detailed question. Make sure you get the right data to actually answer those follow-up questions and not get left sort of like, well, I had this one slide that answers what yes, no, but doesn't go anywhere. Or I've also seen scenarios where people are like, Ken, do we have good hiring quality? I'm like, well, we hire great people, but they don't stick around. So I don't know that like hiring quality is really the question that we're having.
We,
Um,
sorry. I mean,
no.
to catch you. So we ran across that where we were turning people over and they're like, well, we're just not picking the right people. And they were turning over very quickly. And it came to like the people were very qualified. They could do all the work. They were competent on the job, but we had not told them in advance how difficult it was going to be. And so like they showed up thinking it was going to be one thing, it was another, and they could do the task. But once they realized, oh gosh, this is always like this. It's never better than this. This is how it's always going to be. That's when they would bail out and quit. And so yeah, that quality one is such a powerful one. And I hear people all the time that some of you out there listening now may be debating that with your own team. What does quality even mean when it comes to hiring? Is it retention, performance, something else? And that's a tricky one.
Yeah. And sometimes you have questions that are just scary to answer. Like we see Kelly posting the question of like, what is our compensation philosophy? And I know I've been in conversations where it's like, okay, do we want to be the high payer, get the top people, but we're gonna have to work them really hard to get the value of that? Or are we going to lower the pay rate, have better work-life balance, hire more people so we spread the work out a little bit more broadly? And just being able to define what do you mean when you say compensation philosophy? Like, are we talking about just how much? Are we talking total compensation? Like the details really make that question useful or confusing.
I had a chance to meet a lady, Kathy White. She's the head of HR for Habitat for Humanity Philadelphia. And she was telling me that they actually try to do some things around sharing their compensation philosophy with employees in the interest of pay transparency and sort of sharing what this is like. And she was ready, she was equipped, but she released it before her managers were ready. And
Hmm.
so it created all these other problems and questions and challenges back to, they're telling me this, but that's not what it reflects in my actual paycheck. And so she had to like, listen, we're going to roll this back and redo it. And I'm going to make sure people are ready to answer these questions because most of the ones that the people who were fielding it, it was just snowballing and ending up on her desk in her lap and created more headaches. And so, yeah, like the conversational philosophy question and getting clear with that with your leadership so you can actually communicate that in a way that makes sense because your people may not need to know 75th percentile for key roles and market rates and everything else. They may just need to know, hey, listen, when you build this skill or have this experience or this degree, that's when your pay starts to move. They may just need that level of awareness on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I think one of the other pieces is like questions can have sub questions. So like,
Mhm.
what is it that I need to do to get the compensation I'm looking for is a really different question from how are we going to pay as an organization, but they're linked. And so being able to sort of like do the cascade of here's our question as a business. The answer we give is going to trigger all these other questions for employees that we still have to answer. I think is a really important way of thinking about the way you use data and the conversations you have to drive success in your business.
If anybody out there has figured out the question you can ask or the communication you can give, or no one asks any follow-up questions, we would love to see it, by the way. Yet to find that in my years of working as an HR leader and advising others. It's change management may be our superpower, but it's also just a big part of the work we do in communicating around things every single day. So good stuff.
Yeah. So one thing that we encounter a lot in HR is we start with something really specific. Very often it's like there's an activity or a thing we've done that we're just like, how do I show that it was valuable? Very often it's like, what's the ROI on this program that we did? And uh, we just did a webinar featuring the question and realizing that like sometimes it's not even the right question. Sometimes the person that you're doing something for isn't really interested in the financial outcome. They want to see some practical issue be resolved, and they don't need to have a number on everything. And in this case, our CEO really wanted to make sure that everyone who took a leave had a good experience and was not overly focused on how much money does it save me, how much money does it make me. And so the question of ROI was just not really a relevant one for us. It was much more about what impact is this going to have? Can we show that people who've taken a leave had a better experience? And so the standard ROI question was the wrong one for that program and showing that it was valuable. Have you had a scenario where you're like, this really was not the right question? How did you make it more clear or measurable or relevant?
The ROI one I sort of want to touch on because we had an opportunity. We were rolling out a new program and like ROI was the ultimate thing we are going to get to. But this was not a tomorrow I'll be able to give you an update, Ken, and let you know how that's going. This was a hey, 9 months from now I'll have an idea, and then a year from now I'll have a pretty firm answer for you. But early on, our leadership was like, this was a lot of time, this was a lot of expense, this was a lot of your effort and focus. How's it going? And so being able to answer them early on with an answer of, hey, listen, this many people have signed in, or here's what we're hearing from people, qualitatively or early sorts of answers around that. That was where I had to go because that was the only data set I had. I had to just start answering with whatever was at my fingertips versus, oh, the ROI is exactly 2.9%, whatever, throwing some numbers out there. I had to be ready to do that. And so that's the other part I wanted to touch on the ROI one where you said, we did some research around this earlier this year, and we actually asked employers, how soon does your leadership expect to hear about ROI?
Mm.
And a significant number of them were like 6 months or less. And again, the things we do in HR, they're human things. And sometimes there's an immediate return. You'll see that right away. Other times it's a longer time horizon. And some of that's setting expectations. And some of that is I've got to have something to give them early on. So I'm at least satisfying that need for information
Mhm.
before we get to the real thing that we're going to deliver later on, which is, hey, here's how it went, full breakdown and getting into the weeds.
Yeah. Sometimes actually it helps to put the timeline into the question itself. So like, what ROI will we achieve in 6 months? And then you can much more clearly be like, that's actually not the right question because you're not going to get any ROI in 6 months. The ROI takes 12 months for this particular project. And so I think that's a really great point of just being explicit with asking a question that flags timeline or other issues in the statement of what you're trying to do can really help you make sure that you don't set a trap for yourself.
It feels like the same conversation we have around when you're setting goals for someone, right? Are they
Mhm.
measurable, clear? Are they time bound? We're looking at those same sorts of things around it when you're trying to craft the right question, because otherwise you get something that's so vague, so broad. Again, are people happy? You're like,
Mhm.
they're doing work that's really hard. They may not be happy at that, but are they sticking around? Are they performing? Well, that's a question we can probably answer. Are they happy? We can give you some generic sentiment, but is that going to really tell you what you want to know as a leader, or do you want to know, hey, listen, Ken is saying work is hard right now, but he's still showing up, he's still plugging away, he's still creating good outcomes. Great, that's what we want to know. We didn't want to know if you're really happy or not because it's not going to change. Like your work is still going to be hard tomorrow. Um, about
I'm
to,
glad.
go ahead, go ahead.
I'm gonna say I'm so glad you said the word goals because I actually really think that when we're talking about what is the research question that we're trying to answer with data or that executives are asking us, we're really trying to define what is the goal of this project. Like I'm going to do a bunch of work for the next 3 weeks to do an analysis, put together a deck, clean data, answer questions. At the end of the day, it's like what is the goal is really defined by that question that you start with. And if that's muddy or inconsistent or messy, you don't have a good goal and then you don't actually give them an answer that makes you look good. And so at times I find this topic to be feel esoteric, but it actually is fundamentally the definition of success to whatever you do when you're playing with an analysis or trying to answer a leader's questions.
Yes, yes, completely agree with you. And it looks like we're getting some like thumbs up and high fives from the audience there. So I'll run with that.
Yeah. So one thing I've also noticed is that if you start practicing this and saying, okay, this was our goal, that's not necessarily the question that the person arrived with. And so you are halfway through a project and like, oh yeah, this isn't actually the question that anybody really cares about. It's what they asked me, but it's not actually what they want to know. Have you ever worked on a project where the like original question got redefined midway?
So I was working with an organization. They were going through some of their problem was their hiring managers were not working well with their HR business partners, their recruiting team,
Mhm.
essentially. Like they felt like timelines were unreasonable. They felt like people, and so they said, "Would you come in and help us communicate to them, help us?" And so I'm like, "Okay, sure. Like we can try to level set, get everybody on the same playing field." And when I got in there, started hearing the things, it was like, you don't need me to do this. You have the data right here. You just haven't shown them the data yet. And so the answer to this big problem of trying to get people who were kind of like butting heads and it was getting frustrating, was boiling up to executive levels, was the answer was, let's get everybody together. Let's show them an actual funnel for hiring and show them when they come to you and say, hey, I need a Ken to do this key data
Mhm.
job. That's not a next week thing. That's I need 100 resumes to narrow down to 10 people to screen three of them on the phone or interview three of them and bring one in with an offer. And that takes this much time to get that done. And when they showed them that thing, they actually brought the data out. I said, listen, I'm not even going to train anybody on this. I just need you to show the data. And suddenly the hiring manager starts showing up saying, hey, listen, I'm thinking I'm going to need this. I want to give you a heads up because it's not ready to start yet, but I want it to be in your head because when it comes, I don't want to surprise you. And I want you to
Yeah.
be ready for, oh, we already have this many people in our pipeline. They're already ready for that job. Thanks for letting me know. And it's created this more proactive sort of approach rather than just reacting and reacting. And again, that's reacting is sort of like what you were getting at there with the
Mhm.
question here, where I just react to something immediately. And almost always it's the wrong answer. It's just or it's not the full answer, the best answer. Being able to actually change midway because we're like, hey, we're going to change horses middle of the race because this was
Mhm.
actually going the direction we're trying to get to versus this finish line no one cares about, as you said. I think
Yeah.
that to me is a good example of how they thought the problem was this. It was actually that we had to change directions and it worked out really well because they walked out of that room with an actual foundation for future conversations that was fruitful, not combative.
Yeah, I love that. I remember I was talking to a HR team reviewing their engagement survey, and the initial question they asked me was like, how do we compare to companies writ broadly, like other retail organizations? I was like, okay, great. I had all the benchmarks, I walked them through it. They suddenly just got awkward and weird and started asking for like ever more specific benchmarks until I was like, you want me to go to another timeline and see what would have happened if you'd made a different choice. That's not possible. I feel a little bit trapped here because that's a different question than what we started with, and I would have shut that down pretty quick. And then I took a step back and was like, if you're asking this question, let me see if I can like tell you something about your organization that might be more useful. And I was like, your HQ employees are less engaged by a lot than your warehouse employees. So the people closest to power and the cushiest, probably highest paid jobs in your organization are less happy than the people in your warehouses who question whether or not they have air conditioning.
Yes.
So something's going on. Why don't we engage with that question? And it just cracked open. And suddenly they were like, yes, something's really wrong in our HQ. We're having all these big culture changes. Everybody's really upset. I was like, all right, that's the question we should be exploring. Like, why is that group so not what you expect them to be? Not this big question that you started with. And so it had to keep getting more specific. And I also had to be able to deflect when they started asking something that was clearly about ego protection and not really about getting an answer.
That's sometimes hard because people who end up in a role like many HR people end up in have this heart of, yes, I can make that work. Yes, I can find an answer to that. Yes, like this attitude of just I will
Mhm.
find a way to get that for you and make it work. Right? Shout out to anybody who's had to, clean a bathroom because somebody didn't show up. Like you're like, okay, I'll just do it. Like that's happened. And so it's hard in that moment to push back and to challenge that and say, I actually don't think you want what you're asking for. I think you're wanting something else. And that can be uncomfortable, but that's a great example of someone just waiting for someone to say it, Ken. They were just waiting for someone to admit this thing and suddenly, okay, now we can address it. But until then, it was kind of awkward and weird. And no one wants to say the one thing that the data are telling us is completely true.
Yeah. And sometimes you don't say it. Sometimes you ask a question that draws people's attention to the thing so that like it can be explored. But like the power of discovery questions in those kinds of moments can really give you more room to change what you're talking about.
Yes.
Um, so we've been talking bigger picture philosophical for the last little bit. I'd like to start getting a little more practical and some things that we make choices on when we're trying to answer these questions that we're talking about. And so I'd love to hear what HR data source you rely on the most and why.
So I will admit that my data source at some jobs was Excel. Whatever I put in there was the data source that I had. So I've been there. So some of you who may be in that bucket for sure, or having to do separate things outside your system. We once had an HR tool that they said, hey, you can load anything in here you want to. You just can't get anything back out of it, essentially. So I'm like, that feels like a terrible job. Now I'm doing duplicate work. So I've used Excel as a source for things, which in some cases is helpful, is handy, but in other cases it's limited in what it can see. It's got security issues, everything else. I've also used the HRIS as a key source of data. I've used surveys as a way to get at some things that you don't know what you're feeling, and you need
Mhm.
something like immediately. I need a quick pulse to sort of feel what's going on here because something's going on and I don't know what it is. Like that example you gave a minute ago, like I can feel something, I just can't put my finger on it. And then even into broader, hey, every other year we did a big survey around benefits and compensation and those sorts of total rewards, look at things, total rewards philosophy,
Mhm.
come back again in the conversation. And so each of those gave me different perspectives on different kinds of things. And so someone could ask me a question and I had to know where the data were to answer that question because the answer to how people feel about their managers was not in that compensation survey. But the questions around how people feel at their benefits also wasn't sitting in my HRIS necessarily. I had to know where to go and where to find those. So for me, it was kind of a range of things.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think the reality is the data you use is going to be determined by the question that you're asking. So for most of my career, I've focused on surveys, primarily because the questions I was being asked were sentiment questions. How do people feel about their company? How do they feel about this policy? How do they feel about being in the military? How do they feel about
Yes.
name your thing? And so surveys were a really good source for that. Now we have other things such as being able to scrape Slack conversations or Glassdoor or other places to be able to see what we're looking for. I think like sites like Glassdoor are really great if what you're looking for is like what people wouldn't tell you in a survey. You might be able to pull from a AI scraping of that or just doing a review. Uh, Now I focus a lot more on platform data. So, like, I'm talking to a reporter who wants to understand if AI is causing applications to spike. And so it's like, well, we have a hiring module. People post jobs and they get applications. Can I just look over time and see what was the total number of posts and what was the total number of applications? Take a ratio. Is that ratio getting bigger? If yes, then we have some signs that application per post is going up. And the timing of it can say, was this happening before AI? Or has it like skyrocketed since? That gives us at least an educated guess that we see signs that this is happening. And I think that's another important thing with the data is like, am I going to answer the exact question or am I going to be able to give you sort of almost a negative space picture? Like I can't say the exact thing, but I can tell you everything around it looks like that's the case. Oh, I think you're on mute.
I'm smiling because I'm thinking about, I know one of the things that you and I had talked about covering today was correlation and causation. And see, I wanted to like challenge, as you're sharing that, I'm like, I wonder if I could challenge that. That's how my mind automatically goes. I don't know if you're like that just because of when you're in the data a lot, sometimes you're a skeptic of things. You're like, I wonder, is it an economy thing? Is it an AI thing? Is it a something else thing? Is it easier to apply now than it was before because it's one click, like they have one click applies on stuff. So I wanted to like go
Yep.
all these different directions about what could lead to that. But the fundamental premise, what you were sharing around, sometimes I can't prove this thing to be true, but I can show you all this other stuff. And I just say, listen, directionally, it looks like this is to be the case based on what I can see right now. I can't conclusively say absolutely 100% sure, but I have nothing right now that I can see in the data that tells me otherwise. And so that's not a bad place to be.
Yeah.
Again, you'd rather be able to say 100% yes. But sometimes in HR, especially, again, we deal with a lot of unknowns, a lot of variables that aren't filled in. And because of that, we have to be comfortable saying, I don't see anything that tells me otherwise. If you have something that you want me to look at, I'm happy to. And being open to that sort of thing, that
Yeah.
that creates a more consultative and good working relationship in that sort of context.
Yeah. I think also being able to ask, like, is this a question you're going to ask me again? Because maybe I can go about getting the data and creating a data flow for it. If not, okay, here's my best guess. Go make your decision. Life goes on. But if you're going to ask me every 6 months the same question, will you resource me to make sure that I actually have the data to answer it? And if the answer is no, then it's like maybe this isn't that important a question. And so I think this is another opportunity for HR people to take a little bit of control over the conversation and say, if this is an important question, it needs to be resourced. And if it's not going to be resourced, then is it an important question?
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. I'll go back and forth on that level of support, right? We saw that in our data this year. I talked about this in a webinar earlier this summer, I believe, where we were looking at some of the research around becoming a data-driven HR function. And the number one key enabler of that was you had to have support. If you didn't have support from your leadership, if you didn't have whether it was resources or tools or right, interest in what you're doing, then we could go and work away endlessly and never actually bring anything that anyone else values. And again, I don't want to paint with a broad brush, but that's where HR gets some of the stereotype, where we just show up in a meeting like, hey, look at our turnover numbers. And they're like, yeah, I actually want to see something else. Tell me something that's
Yeah.
going to help us with what's next, not with just what happened already. And so, yeah, I'm with you on that one for sure.
Yeah. I see some comments about being at a small organization and not having a big data set to work with. What are some of your approaches, Ben, when you're just like, I'm not working at Google. I don't have 10,000 people and everything is data tracked. So like, what do I do?
So I would say, listen, don't feel any shame about being an Excel warrior or a spreadsheet warrior because again, Ken and I both been there. The thing that I did, I had to do at one of my previous jobs is we had we just had no real collection. We just had like employee information, that was it. And we did a little bit of reporting on turnover, but that was it, just high level. And Ken's heard me tell the story before, but you could go through the hallways, you could ask any of our leadership in the business, hey, what's our turnover here? And they would tell you, oh, it's about 55 to 60%. And we had over 600 employees. So that's ridiculous. Hundreds of people every year that were just churning through. But they all knew that number. They didn't know anything below that, though. They had no idea what was the next level down, like one layer
Mhm.
deeper. And so I actually went through, this was the glamour days, okay, the glory days of my HR role. I went through 2.5 years of terminated employee files, pulling them out of the dusty room, loading them back into this because we had not been using it before that. So I could say, hey, listen, over the last 2.5 years, what I can see in the data is that yes, it's right at that 50, 60% mark like we expected, but about half of those people are leaving in the first 30 days on the job. That's what that example I gave earlier. We thought that it was one problem, it was something else. And so I started really being able to tell them, here's some things we can see about this that are actually actionable because that broader turnover number, like, wow, fact of life. What's for lunch? Like we just moved on with things. But if I said, hey, listen, it's happening because of this, or it's happening because of this leader, or it's happening in this area, or it's happening where the area in the areas of the business where the pay is the lowest. Any of those, Ken, would be a next question you could ask about what to do
Yeah.
with it. And that was the thing for me is I had to get us asking better questions because just saying, how do we deal with turnover? Well, we didn't know enough about it to even deal with it yet. And I had to get us that understanding and get there. So for those of you using Excel, it's not that it's a bad thing. You just got to start using it like that in a way that lets you get to a real answer that's value, not just giving a percentage or something else.
Yeah, I love that example because when you had a good question, it told you
Mhm.
what data you needed, and then you could sort of step back and say, like, what do I have? Like,
Yeah.
it's not necessarily
Yes.
formatted for the purpose, but then you did the work.
Yes. Yes. Paper cuts, allergies, all those things were payment for getting an actual amount of data that we could act on. And so if maybe you have fewer employees, okay, you don't have 2 years of hundreds of employees who have
Mhm.
left. That was a big data set actually for me to actually look at. If you have a smaller organization, again, Ken, you talked about surveys as a source of data. That's fine. Use that as a source of data, not just closed-ended questions, multiple choice, but open-ended questions. Is there
Yeah.
something we could do? Someone asked a question earlier about this, Casey. You said, hey, this is one of the things we put in our survey every year. I think it's a great question. I actually love the word respect in there. Like, don't just get someone else to show up, but someone that we respect. How would I get them to come and work at this organization? Like those sorts of open-ended questions are valuable to help you have some context and insight. And thank goodness, Ken, we don't have to manually look at those anymore. So the AI tools help us quickly screen and scan
Mhm.
those and come to some potential outcomes or ideas on how to solve for that faster than I'm reading through comment after comment after comment and just never getting to the end.
Yeah, I often get asked the question of like qualitative and quantitative data, which one do I use? And again, goes back to the question. So like if you're asking what is happening, it's qualitative data. Like that helps you script your better items. It helps you figure out what data you need. Interviews are actually really powerful, just talking to people, especially the ones who you know are advisors or mentors to other people in the organization, just getting their take can really illuminate a lot of stuff. And people are like, data is always numbers. Data is information. Sometimes it's numbers, sometimes it's comments, sometimes it's interviews. It is just information that you can share with other people.
Mm.
Um, and then being able to use that to refine what am I trying to know? Where could that information be? How do I prove this to other people? Especially when the question goes from what is happening to how often is it happening. And that's where you want numbers. That's where a survey becomes really powerful. So like once the interviews have revealed we have this turnover problem that seems to be connected to a leadership issue, now we can do a survey, ask about leadership stuff, and be like, oh wow, the place where all the turnover is happening gets really low scores, and everywhere else is doing fine. And so these give you ammunition. I think it's also important not to get stuck always looking backwards and sometimes saying, like, if this is an ongoing problem, the data is still there. So I can just start collecting it now and move forward.
Yes, that's it's a this sort of tug of war, right? I have to know what happens because that helps me predict what's next. It gives me a baseline for things. That measurement is a good thing, but I also don't always want to be showing up saying, "Well, this is just looking on my shoulder," because the windshield is bigger than the rearview mirror for a reason. And we have to be helping our leaders plan for what's next. The more we do that, by the way, the more that changes the persona of HR just being compliance focused, the no police, backward looking. It gives us this persona as a true ally and partner to the business that many of us strive for. I've been on the outside of that, hoping to get in. I've been on the inside of that circle, and the difference in when you share, you speak up, and again, you're using data. You're not just saying, "Well, I think, I feel, or it worked one time," but here's what we know to be true. You have a different level of respect in those conversations that is due you, honestly, is due to the good work you're doing.
So I think one of the other important things about like the questions, sometimes questions are neutral. You don't care what the well, you might care what the answer is, but like the question has value, whether it is a yeah, it's happening a lot, no, it's not happening at all. Either way, I needed to know that answer.
Yes.
Sometimes you ask questions that are like, I really want it to be this way. Like I really want the answer to be X, and it's not, it's C. Um, have you ever encountered a moment where you're like, I've done this big thing, I've gotten these people to ask these questions, they've gotten the data, and it's all not saying anything that I want it to say?
We would all like to think that every time we go and do some analysis like you and I've talked about, and again, many of you have done this yourself, you're going down this path, you're hoping to come to this realization. Like in the movies, it's always like this sudden, we found it. This is the one thing we needed, and now we know what to do. In real life, sometimes you get to the end and it's you open the trunk and it's empty. There's no treasure in there. Or there's something you're like, oh, that's gross. I didn't want that. That's the truth. That happens. And I'm trying to think of a good time where I've been at that place. I mean, yes, I've we thought that we had problems with managers in one of our areas of our business. We
Mhm.
were asking questions around that because we'd heard some rumblings and stuff. I'd heard from again rumblings. I'd heard from two very vocal employees who had things to say about everything. Okay, so they always had an opinion on everything. And so I thought, okay, then we're going to find something in this data we can act on. And so we did this survey and we actually found that generally people were pretty happy with the managers, but some of the policies that those managers had to enforce that were company created were where the
Mhm.
problem was. So they had to do things that they had to be the bad guy or the bad gal because they had to enforce this thing that had been decided because of a customer requirement or something else. And so in those cases, again, I can't wave my magic wand and make that person not have to be the person there. The only thing we could do is communicate from an all hands perspective or something saying, hey, listen, we know that some of you are frustrated with this thing. I just want to remind you that's a customer requirement. That's not because your manager said so. They don't get to choose that. That's something that's put on all of us, and we all have to abide by that. Even the CEO over here, yeah,
Mhm.
him too. And so making those things clear could help to solve for that some. But that was an example where I was expecting to see, because these people were so specific about the instances and issues, I thought we're going to find some really juicy stuff here and have to step in and maybe remove a manager, as serious as some of the stuff sounded.
Mhm.
And then it turned out to be kind of just, no, not really. It was more about something else entirely.
Yeah. I had a similar moment. I was working with an organization and they really wanted to justify doing manager training. And they were digging in and saying, like, oh, look, all these nurses are leaving. And it's because their managers are bad. And that's going to give us the justification we need to do the manager training that everybody wants. And they're like, Ken, can you give us the data to prove this? I was like, okay, I'm going to go look at the data. And I was like, actually, it has very little to do with the managers. They are most of the people love their managers. What really we're finding is that it has to do with whether or not that department is flexible or inflexible in terms of its compliance requirements. Like the ones that are like really rigid, and it's like nursing is you do this thing almost robotically because of the medical compliance issues tended to have higher departure rates than the ones that had looser, broader care opportunity. So they could just practice more of their work and what they trained for. And there's like, sorry, this isn't a manager issue, but let's think about why you really want to do this. It's just to hold on to your nurses. So your question really isn't, are the managers bad? Your question is really, what can we do to hold on to our nurses? And
Yes.
so it was very easy to flip it and say, this is a great education spot for them, a re-engagement, putting more effort into showing them how following those rules saves lives, because that's going to hold on to them. And that's the power of asking a better question rather than getting stuck on where you started.
I have another data source that we haven't talk about that's
Go for it.
sort of related, assessments. We actually had, there was a case study I did not long ago. The healthcare organization facing the same challenge, nursing turnover. Again, they're like, what's the thing? Is it pay? Everybody, look, everybody else is paying more than us. Turns out it wasn't that. It turns out that the nurses were not loving that sort of breakdown, just like you said.
Mhm.
Like nursing is a science, very sciencey and specific and rigid. Nursing is an art. It's feely and helpful and loving.
Mhm.
And what they started doing was an assessment of nurses that came in because they found that they sort of filtered into one of those two buckets and they slotted them into those roles based on how they fell in there. Where some of them were like, listen, I got into this because it pays well. It's a steady job. I'll always have hours and overtime. Give me all the night shifts. And they were perfectly happy working in the more compliance oriented roles or medication
Yeah.
administration or whatever the examples were. And the other ones that were like, I've got to hug someone or this shift was not complete. And they slotted those people into there and their turnover dropped dramatically from that.
Mhm.
And it just came down to they figured out the answer was that fit piece you mentioned. And their answer was, how do we figure out the fit before they even start? And they started
Yes.
pre-hiring with assessments on that.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important for HR to coach leaders and others on making sure that the question they're asking doesn't have a baked assumption of they already know what the answer is. And so you want to always push the question back to something more neutral, where the answer is useful no matter what it is. If you only want a particular answer, you're probably too far down already and haven't really explored the right level of the conversation.
Can you give me an example of that? 'Cause I think that's great advice. And I want someone, if you get nothing else from today, that's a great takeaway. If they're asking for this like super narrow, you're like, okay, I know the three people you're talking about when you ask this question. I know who they are. Like, if it gets to that level, it's too specific. Ask what's an example of a question they like that shows up, and then how should they flip it?
Yeah, so I think a really good example is that scenario of like, I want to show that managers are bad,
Okay.
like, because I want to do a training. So I want you to measure the manager proficiency across all our teams. But, and they'll often say, because I already have a plan in motion that I want to do to solve a problem that I've already defined. And you're like, whoa, okay. Why am I going? If you already know the answer to the question, why am I doing the research if you've already got a plan on what to do about it? Do you have a plan on what to do if that's not the answer? And if they're like, no, because that's the answer. I'm like, you're almost certainly too far down already because they've already skipped the confirmation of is there even a manager problem in the first place?
They've got a
Um,
conclusion when they show up. That's the thing. They've got a conclusion.
yes.
They just need you to validate it versus I'm asking a big question that I don't know the answer to yet. Okay. That's to me, that helps me and I think the audience too to really define
Yep.
that. If they're asking you a question for you to go solve and they're already telling you the answer right there in the moment,
Yeah.
pump the brakes there. Let's slow
Yeah.
down. Let's back up like two steps and figure out is that even the right problem to solve yet? The right question to ask, and so
Yep.
on. Okay. Good stuff.
If I find that the managers aren't an issue, do you have an alternative plan? And they're like, yes, actually, it could also be this, and I have a plan for that. Or it could be this, and I have a plan for that. Okay, great. You're kind of neutral on the answer, as opposed to, yeah, there's really only one answer to this question, so
Yes.
we're just all wasting our time for some political reason.
Mm,
Um, and that's a good moment to sort of push the question up a little bit to try and see if there's more options so that if you do find that they're wrong, you have a way to flip it towards some what they actually want to accomplish rather than the the task they want to perform.
well, that takes me back to sort of that the example I gave on the hiring funnels, where
Mhm.
their HR team was like, help us convince them to stop showing up last minute. And like you could have convinced them already, but you thought they're the wrong ones. You're actually the wrong ones. You haven't shared the stuff with them yet. Share
Yeah.
that, and there's that's not even an issue anymore. You're assuming that they're the culprit or the troublemaker or the problem in this, and the solution was transparency. I don't know why that matters in the big world. How about shared data? I don't know. We work together. We're on the same team. But, and yet some people have to be reminded of that at the same
Yep.
time.
Absolutely. So we're getting to towards the last 15 minutes of our time. I would like Elaine to share our closing poll before we jump into Q&A and we can start answering some of the other questions that have popped up. Um, Particularly, someone asked, how can HR quantify their value add to the bottom line? This is a really important piece, and I think there's probably a bunch of different ways to answer the question. Uh, I just did a webinar uh, last week that unpacked like how do you do this, and I can share one or two quick slides. And Ben, I'd love your thoughts on this approach and how it sort of aligns with where you've done work in this space. So let me share my screen for just a moment. And so I like to really think about any situation where I have to answer an ROI question off of an activity through these six buckets, and specifically in this order. So the first thing I always want to think about is what is the impact of the activity that I took. Often people focus on what is it I actually did, which can be a distraction. Are you trying to improve development time? Are you trying to improve turnover? Are you trying to improve uh,
Hiring
quality
quality.
of hiring quality? Those are the things that you're trying to do. You want to affect the business. And so you always need to start with what effect am I trying to have on the business? If I have that effect on the business, how could I show the ROI? Turnover becomes turnover costs. Development time becomes more time in market, more product sold. That allows you to say, if I have this impact, I could rate the financial result in this way through mechanisms we have in the business. Then you can ask yourself, does this activity have that impact that leads to that ROI? If not, then it's the wrong activity. And I think to our whole philosophy of like, are you asking the right question? Starting with what is the impact and what is the ROI really allows you to get to, is this even the right activity in the first place? Because I find that a lot of times it's just not the right activity. Um, and then for the rest, it's where HR tends to spend a lot more time. What are some leading indicators, engagement scores, learning scores? Outputs, did people actually show up for a training? How many hours were trained? And then inputs is really the costs and the time you spent on it. The last three we have tend to have a lot of data on. The first two are a space where if we start thinking there, we really set ourselves up for success for ROI conversations. If anyone's interested, you can find our the webinar unpacking this whole thing at HRCI, and we can send out the link to it as part of the follow-up to this presentation. But Ben, what are your thoughts?
Uh, I think about when I started out in one of the organizations I worked for, my remit was very different and it evolved over time. So the way I answer that question, what is the value we're bringing, was different over time.
Mhm.
Initially, it was if they were going to put it very plainly, it wasn't spelled out this clearly, but I sort of heard this in conversations was, listen, last year we paid over $200,000 for search fees for some of these jobs we're hiring for. They're very technical and specific. If you can find even one of them, you were worth it. So go find one of those people. So I knew that it was
Yeah.
recruiting and being able to bring people in and source the right candidates. That was where my value was. And if I showed up and did all kinds of other stuff, if I built training and I supported managers and all this other stuff, organize the snacks in the kitchen, any number of things, and didn't bring in candidates that we hired and saved money on, then I failed. The
Yeah.
ROI was not there for them to hire me. Over time, that started to evolve and change. We had a new group of people come on. The turnover was high in that unit. They said, go troubleshoot that. Go find out what's
Mhm.
going on. Go solve for that because it's costing us and customer relationships and everything else. Don't let us lose any more of those good people. And so that became my priority for the next few months of trying to troubleshoot and solve for and build relationships there and take care of that. Again, if during that time, if I was just recruiting and not filling that role. So for me, it was that tight connection you and I talk about often. You started
Mhm.
with know the business impact. And for me, I knew what those things were the business expected of me. And honestly, it was pretty easy because when I show up when an executive meeting, they're like, "Hey, how's that thing going?" Whatever that thing was they asked me about, I knew I better have an update on it both now and in the future because that was a priority for them. So it changed over time to from reducing turnover, making sure I was prioritizing hiring. We had made some benefits changes. Like again, how do you prove the ROI of benefits change? Maybe it saved us money. Maybe people were just
Mhm.
happier and they
Yeah.
weren't leaving our business because of that. We're seeing that in exit survey data. So again, that goes back to our question earlier on where do you find the data? It's all over. But that's a great question that you could really unpack almost endlessly. For you, if
Mhm.
you don't know what your leaders expect of you, that's where your best value ROI is going to start. It's going to come from there. And Ken, I think you're the model you shared, but again, the audience is like love that so much. They wanted it. That model helps to walk you through that so well and gives you a framework to make sure that you're touching the things that they care most deeply about.
Yeah, I actually use that model with one of my colleagues to determine whether or not we should go into a meeting presenting the ROI of a project or the potential ROI of a project based on turnover or payroll errors. And we did the math. It was for a small subgroup, and we're like, payroll errors can be really expensive, but we're talking about a tiny subgroup for this project. It's pocket change for this group. However, they all are paid a lot of money. And so one of them leaving vastly exceeds the cost of the intervention we were going to do. So let's just go in talking about turnover. We have the payroll error data if we need it, but like it's not the thing to hang our hat on. And so that was really helpful to them when they followed this framework to identify like how do I do this math?
One of the things we talked about earlier was, again, I keep going with the data sources thing over and over. I'm sorry, like my mind is hung on that for whatever
Yeah.
reason, because you mentioned earlier, I think you mentioned like we have other sources of data now. We have other things we can be tapping into.
Mhm.
This, conversation I've had this conversation on anyway. And we have more sources of data than ever before.
Mhm.
There was an organization that I was talking to in the biotech space, about 25 employees. Your comment about highly paid employees reminded me of this because
Mhm.
they were turning over the occasional employee that was like $250,000. These very highly paid engineers that were doing super specific things. The company is incredible. They actually have built a blood draw that replaces the biopsy for some types of cancer. So,
Wow.
like that's so wonderful for people as an evolution, but that's so important that they don't lose their people. And they were telling me that they're hearing people that are leaving saying, "Hey, listen, I'm too busy to do the work you hired me to do." And so they started looking at their data on meetings and who was in meetings, how many hours they were in meetings. And they realized that some of the people that were hired to do this creative research were spending 80% of their time in meetings, Ken. They had no time to actually do the development and to think big and to be creative. And so again, we have so many sources of data, and sometimes we don't even remember. For me, I feel like, oh yeah, we have that now because we didn't when I started as an HR leader. Okay, that stuff didn't exist, but now we can see those types of insights and details about work and how it's structured and how it gets done. And we can, some of the tools will even flag, hey, these people are all doing this emails after hours or off their normal work schedule. And those kind of things can tell us and be an indicator potentially of future issues down the line. So I just get all excited about the types of things. I don't want to get wrapped up in that too much, but just knowing that you can answer so many different questions with those, and that excites me. Um, can I can I throw out a funny story really quickly
Go for it.
that touches on some of what we talked about earlier about knowing the business? So there was a young lady who reached out to me a while back and said, "Hey, I'm applying for a job as an HR business partner. Any advice?" So I gave her some pieces of recommendations and things. I said, "Let me know how it goes." And she circled back to me and said, "Hey, I got the job, but I almost didn't." I was like, "Oh, wow, okay. Well, congratulations. What happened?" She said, "Well, we're going through the interview, and the CEO, at the end of the interview, the CEO springs it on me. He said, 'Why do you think our capital costs are increasing every year?'"
Mm.
She's like, "I'm not the head of HR. I'm just an HR business partner. How would I even know this?" Well, this company produces rubber parts that are manufactured in their plants. And so she's like, "I know it's a rubber company. Well, rubber doesn't grow on trees." It was her rubber, natural latex rubber comes from an actual tree. It grows on a tree. And the CEO thought she was being a little cheeky, a little funny, said, "Oh, that's brilliant. I love it. You're the kind of people we need. We're going to hire you." But in the moment, she was so embarrassed because she said, "I didn't know how the business actually worked. I didn't know how they made money. I completely stepped in it and it just happened to work out for me." And she
Yep.
committed from that day forward, "I will never be caught flat footed not knowing how the business makes money, what the capital costs are, what the profits look like, what eats up that profit margin, what are the big expenses." She said, "I will never be caught not knowing those things again because that was a key moment that could have cost her an actual job." So for all of us out there listening to that, if you don't know some of those kinds of answers for your business, your organization, that's going to help you as we're the bigger conversation can today about all these questions we can answer. You may be going down a path that's going to answer something that's related to 2% of their costs versus 90% of their costs.
Mhm.
And you need to know some of those things so you may know where to push back or how to ask better questions to fit it to what the business actually needs from you.
I think you also come right up next to another important issue for HR to really process, which is if we're here as part of the business, and yet many of us are personally here because we want to help people or we want to engage with the human aspect of the workplace. And making sure that those two things don't butt heads is what I always believe is the ultimate goal of HR. Like, how do I make sure that those two things are mutual wins? And you can only do that if you understand what the business wants.
Mhm.
Whereas I bump into a lot of people like, I'm here to advocate for the employee. Okay, but you need to advocate for them in a way that aligns with what the business is trying to achieve so that they don't become an obstacle. And often that's where you need to have the right data and the right question. It's not how do I make sure employees are having a better time? It's how do I reduce the costs of these issues that are happening? Oh, it's because of employee engagement issues. I love a study that was done showing that stocking times on retail shelves are directly connected to engagement. Stores that had high engagement stayed stocked. Customers came in, they saw what they wanted, they bought it, they made more money. Stores where engagement was low, customers came in, they didn't see the thing on the shelf, went, well, that was a waste of my time, and they left, and the store didn't make money. And so it was a very straightforward, you treat these people well, you will make more money, so they did. And so I think it's really important to align those two things and ask the questions that connect them rather than pull them apart.
Well, I love that example because I was reading a case study. It's a couple of years old now, but it's a great story about any of you who work. Retail is a good example. If you work in a company with a consumer facing brand, whether you're in a smaller town or you're just a company that everybody knows the name of what you do, and they could be customers. So there was an organization that sold mobile phones, phone plans, things like that, and their candidate experience was so poor that people in there were saying, I will never shop with you again because of how they were treated in the hiring process. They were ignored, they were ghosted, they were not responded to in a timely manner, or they get the update 6 months after applying saying, hey, this job closed, you didn't get it, which at that point, don't say anything to them. It's too late anyway. It
Mhm.
just makes it awkward. And so their team said, listen, you are costing us money and you need to stop doing that. And so they started revamping and revising their candidate experience. And after that, it was so cool because they got to actually start saying, hey, listen, we can attribute this measure of revenue because of people saying, I was treated so well in this hiring process. I didn't get the job and I would still come back and buy from Ken's Data Mart because they were so good to me, right? They treated them so well in that. And that's a great example of, again, showing the value, showing the ROI in a way that's super creative. Now, you probably can't do that if you're in, supply chain, something like that. But if you're in one of those consumer facing hospitality or even healthcare, would you come and be a patient here? Would you send your family here? Like those kind of questions can give you some interesting data. And that data, by the way, some of those questions are not in your HR systems. They are in marketing, they are in other brand areas where you can do some interesting cross pollination and see the opportunities. So I love you shared that one because like that's where my mind goes immediately. Like, how cool would it be to say we are responsible for net new revenue to the business as a talent function? That's pretty wild.
Absolutely. So we are at the end of our time. I'd love to thank everyone for participating. We will share links and content in follow-up, including the slide that I showed on screen. We'll also share a link to the webinar so that people can find the full presentation of that model and the examples we use to discuss it. So I also think we can make a point of directing you to the HiBob Tools Hub, where we have lots of very practical tools that you might be able to use to help you make better use of your data and ask better questions. So Ben, thank you for your time and sharing your wisdom with our participants, and hope to see you soon. We're going to be talking about payroll stuff in October.
Looking forward to it. I can't wait. To everybody else out there, thank y'all for joining us. Thank you for the good work you're doing, for pressuring and challenging yourself to ask better questions. As Ken and I have talked about today, it's an opportunity for you to unlock new value that you can deliver back to the people in the business. Thank you.
Bye.